Well, Margaret was born of a farming family in Tuscany, Italy in the 13th century. When she was 7, her mother died. And 2 years later, his father remarried, and her new stepmother wanted nothing to do with her and showed her very little sympathy or affection. And you can imagine Margaret's desire for affection and love from the loss of her mother at a young age. And you don't have to be a psychologist to see that the fallen world had dealt Margaret a couple blows in her early years of life: the abandonment and loss of a mother, and then the rejection of her stepmother. Margaret grew up, and she was apparently extremely beautiful. And at 17, she eloped with the son of a local nobleman. They lived as lovers in his family's castle for 9 years. She lived those 9 years as his mistress. And in those years, she also had doubts about her situation. Somewhat like St. Augustine, she prayed for purity, but not yet. And during this period, Margaret was also very compassionate to the poor. She was also very accustomed to seek out quiet places where she would dream of a life given to virtue and to the love of God. She was divided. She wanted to get her life right, but was unable to get herself out of that situation. He was very content to live as lovers with her. And she bore him a son. She often asked him to marry her and to rectify their sinful life. And he promised, and he promised, and he promised, but he never did. One day she was waiting for him to return home from a journey, but instead was met by his dog. And she followed the dog into the forest, where she found his body. He had been murdered. And his tragic death shook her. She blamed herself for the sinful life they were living as the cause of his death. She returned to his relatives all the jewelry and the property he had given her, and then left the castle. And then with her little son, she went back to her father's house. And her father would have welcomed her back, but her stepmother refused. And so they were turned away and basically homeless. And of course, this is a time before social services existed. She had nowhere to go and no way to make a living. She was still quite beautiful and contemplated prostitution as a way to earn her living. And she prayed. And in her prayer, she received an inspiration to go to the town of Cortona and to find the Franciscans that were there. And so she went to that town. And when she got there, 2 ladies of Cortona noticed her loneliness, offered her assistance, and took her home with them. And then afterwards introduced them to the Franciscan friars of that city. And for 3 years, Margaret had to struggle with temptations. But through prayer and penance, and especially the spiritual counsel of the friars, she underwent a deep healing and conversion. She became a third-order Franciscan. Her illegitimate son became a Franciscan friar. She was devoted to the Eucharist and to the Passion of Jesus. And this love fueled her great charity, and she established a hospital and a community of sisters to care for the sick there. And those who were struggling with sin were drawn to her for advice and counsel. She died a saint, St. Margaret of Cortona. Now, knowing Margaret in her young adult life, you wouldn't think that she would have become a saint. She had been wounded early in life and acted out of that woundedness, which formed a pattern of sin in her life. And that brought her much heartache and misery. Her attempts to find true love, affirmation, affection, intimacy, led her into the opposite: further rejection, manipulation, and ultimate abandonment. Jesus didn't create her for misery, but for life and for freedom. And he had desired for her, we talked about last week, that Catholic wholeness, the wholeness of being. He longed to heal her, and her healing started when she found him in the depths of her suffering and abandonment. And he didn't shame her about her past sins or her present struggles. He brought her wounds into his, and her sanctity came through the healing. It's the same for us. Today we celebrate the solemnity of All Saints. Even though it's tomorrow, we have permission to celebrate it at the Sunday Masses today. And even on our altar here, we have our relics here of the True Cross, of St. John Vianney. We're going to have his performance here on this coming Friday at 7 o'clock. St. Therese of Lisieux, a relic of her. A rosary bead from Blessed Solanus Casey, who's kind of next in line among American saints. And then an Indian saint, Saint Alphonsa. So we rejoice in all those who are in heaven, who are perfected in their humanity and living the full life of the Trinity. They praise God with the angels. And in today's passage from Revelation, we get a glimpse into that rejoicing and that hymn. Salvation comes from our God who is seated on the throne and from the Lamb. They didn't arrive to heaven or sanctity on their own. They've turned themselves over to the Lamb, who heals and sets them on fire to be fully alive in divine love. And they intercede for us. They're very interested in helping us to arrive where they are. And in the communion of the saints, which we are a part of here in Mass, they're not very far away. And as St. Margaret of Cortona's life shows us, they may have had parts of their life that weren't holy, parts of their life that were still captured, still awaiting the rescue from Jesus in that woundedness and sin slavery that sin brings. And you notice the elder that is speaking to St. John in this vision. The elder doesn't say, these are the ones who lived perfect lives while on earth. No. What does he say to St. John? These are the ones who have survived the time of great distress, and have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. St. John Vianney, of course, whose relic is here, he once told his parishioners, the saints did not all begin well, but they all ended well. And the 19th century playwright Oscar Wilde, who himself knew the struggle of sin and grace in his own life, he wrote in one of his plays, every saint has a past, and every sinner has a future. And what do these lines say to us? It takes away our alibis and our lame excuses that I could never be a saint. It should instill in us hope. Dr. Bob Schuchts asks some crucial questions in chapter 1 of Be Healed, which we're walking through right now. In the realization of our pain and woundedness or past sins, we should ask ourselves, do you recognize the need for healing? Do you want to be healed? Have you given up hope that you can be healed? Do you believe that Jesus desires to heal you? What attitude of doubt or unbelief stand in the way of you receiving Jesus' powerful healing love? Imagine what St. Margaret contended with when she discovers that her lover has been brutally murdered and she's on the street. I've really blown it now. I'm beyond rescue. How could Jesus ever take me back? What did she do? She prayed, she listened, and she heard. Not shame and condemnation, but the voice of her true love, Jesus. She turned away from that habitual self-reliant strategy of trying to numb the pain of her abandonment and rejection through impure relationships, and instead began to trust him. And the suffering of her life had kind of stripped down her pretensions, rationalizations, defense strategies. And she had a really passionate heart that kind of got her into trouble. But with her passionate heart, when it was healed, propelled her into sanctity. She turned to Jesus in the truth about her life, her wounds, her pain, and she found him there. He met her precisely there. And God's love heals. Holiness comes through healing. The most foundational aspect of Jesus' healing is establishing us in his love. It's divine love that heals us and establish us in security of his love. Dr. Bob suggests that we think of ourselves as a tree. So the roots of the tree is the security that is rooted and grounded in unconditional love. And from those roots comes the trunk of the tree, which is maturity, that is growing in love. And the fruits of that trunk is purity. So it goes from security to maturity to purity. On the other hand, our woundedness creates an insecurity at our roots. And from insecurity comes immaturity. And from immaturity comes impurity. But the Lord can help trace us back to from our sin, from the fruits of the tree, as it were, from that impurity, back to an underlying immaturity and insecurity in love. St. Margaret had the wounds of an early death of her mother in that abandonment, and a stepmother who then rejected her. That would create a deep insecurity in love. And it seems like that led her to address that pain with an immature relationship, cohabitation, which actually only compounded the rejection and abandonment of her life. And of course, her son was the profound good that the Lord brought from that difficult relationship, because the good Lord can bring good out of any relationship. But the game changer in Margaret's life came when her suffering led her to open her heart to the infinite and unconditional love of Jesus. Her biographers highlight that she was very devoted to two things: to the Holy Eucharist and to the Passion of Jesus. And you think about it, what are those two things? The Passion of Jesus, right, where we encounter his absolute love for me, that he is doing this for me, to rescue me. And the Holy Eucharist, which of course is his body and blood, right, the Eucharistic sacrifice, which makes his passion, death, and resurrection available to us through uniting his body and blood with us. Right? The two things that ground us in the unconditional love of Jesus. So when we are vulnerable and allow Jesus to love us in the worst parts of ourselves, in that deep insecurity of love, where we hurt the most, that begins a new relationship of security. And to make it easier for us to do that, what has the Lord done? He was crucified for us. And when he rose from the dead in the power of his resurrection, the wounds didn't disappear, but they have changed. They don't hurt him anymore, but now his wounds pour forth his healing grace into ours. Kind of like what he did with St. Thomas at that appearance of the resurrection, when he appears to them and says, "Look at my hands and my feet. Put your fingers in the nail marks and in my side." He invites us to let him take our wounds into his. For in the words of the prophet Isaiah, by his wounds we are healed. And don't we long for that deep down security that we are loved? Don't we long for the maturity and the purity that it brings? You know, St. Margaret tells us now, you can be a saint. It starts when we open our wounds to the love of Jesus in a way that we have yet to discover. And so let me offer you three practical responses you can do to this invitation from St. Margaret and all the saints. First, read the book, Be Healed. And not to read it like a novel, but to go through it and to answer the questions that Dr. Bob, or the exercises that he offers, because it's in the reflection where stuff happens. And I'll guarantee you, if you approach it kind of like a workbook and you start doing it, something's going to happen. I know so my heart's already been moved by it in my own life. So that's the first thing. Read the book, again, as a workbook. Start working through it. Second, come to the Tuesday talk this Tuesday after the Mass. We're having Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers, who's an international speaker that's a local guy for us. He's going to speak to us on forgiveness, about being rich in mercy, because forgiveness is a huge part of our healing. So come to the talk on Tuesday. And then finally, after Mass today, go over to Coffee and Donuts. Not just for the coffee and donuts and fellowship, which is great, but our school kids have these awesome displays of saints. There's probably about 50 of them in there. And it's just amazing what our school's kids have come up with. And many of the teachers have commented to me about how the students' lives they've made a connection with one of the saints, and they've engaged with that saint, and it's just beautiful to see those connections happen. Today we celebrate all the saints, and they are a great multitude. Jesus wants to add us to that number. Holiness comes through healing.